So with the Book of Boba Fett right around the corner and poised to show us a little bit of the criminal underworld in the galaxy after the Empire, I figured today we could talk a little bit about what we know so far about crime after the Battle of Jakku and the surrender of the Empire. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So, as we all know, the Book of Boba Fett, coming later this year, will show us sort of a little bit of the state of the criminal underworld at this point in galactic history. And I figured it's worth taking a look at what we know about the state of the criminal underworld at this time, because it's probably very much in flux. You see, a lot in the galaxy changed during the events of Return of the Jedi. Not only did the Emperor die during the Battle of Endor, which ultimately set the Empire on its path to collapse, but Jabba the Hutt was killed, which really shook up the criminal underworld. As we see in The Mandalorian, the sort of criminal entities working on Tatooine seem to have no real leadership. And as we see in the trailers for the upcoming Book of Boba Fett, we will start to see the beginning of a new hierarchy within the criminal underworlds of the Star Wars galaxy. But what exactly is the state of the criminal underworld that Boba Fett is walking into? Well, let's start by taking a look at exactly who's in control. What happened to the major crime syndicates? Well, as far as we know, they're all still intact in some state. Now, it does appear that the Hutts were significantly weakened by the death of Jabba the Hutt and the chaos of the collapse of the Empire, and my assumption is that all of them were very severely impacted. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point during the Book of Boba Fett we hear about Black Sun or the Pike Syndicate still playing a role in the galaxy. However, I would imagine that during the turmoil of the collapse of the Galactic Empire, many of these crime syndicates had a little bit of a sort of power restructuring themselves. I think it's also worth noting, and I think it'd be something interesting to see in the Book of Boba Fett, that a lot of Imperial military equipment is now sort of just out there. I could totally see powerful crime syndicates making use of old Imperial walkers or even Imperial warships like Imperial-class Star Destroyers as their own personal vessels and equipment, since all of that military hardware is basically abandoned. And I think it's also noteworthy that during the reign of the Empire, Imperial sort of officials were actually a pretty good source of money for these crime syndicates. Whether we're talking corrupt officials who would sort of allow these criminal syndicates to work unopposed, or Imperial officers who themselves would be customers of things like illegal substances, the loss of that powerful entity that would have allowed these crime syndicates to operate unchecked is probably a pretty significant hit to their functionality. And it's also noteworthy that that incredibly corrupt and sort of morally negative government was replaced with the New Republic, a government that seems to hold sort of the values of the law in a much higher regard than the Galactic Empire. Basically, I couldn't see the New Republic in any way, shape, or form working with these crime syndicates at all. Now, The Mandalorian did give us a pretty good look at some elements of the criminal underworld. We saw things like gangs of sort of raiders operating, we see small bands of criminals operating independently of larger criminal enterprises, and we see some of the shattered remnants of those larger criminal enterprises. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see just a continuation of that into what we see in the Book of Boba Fett. Now, that being said, I think we're going to see some major growth in criminal enterprises during the events of the Book of Boba Fett, because this is the perfect time for a criminal enterprise to operate. The current galactic government has just come out of a major war and is relatively weak. On top of that, they're still trying to figure out where they fit in the galaxy, and so maybe they're not quite as effective at enforcing their own laws. This is great news for any criminal enterprise that wants to operate during this time period, since they can basically do so unopposed throughout probably about half of the galaxy. I would imagine the core worlds are still pretty locked down and relatively under control by the New Republic, but parts of the Mid-Rim and definitely the Outer Rim are basically the Wild West, unpoliced, no man's land. So I would expect to see from the Book of Boba Fett the beginning of the formation of a new criminal power structure. That's what I really expect to see, but we don't really know for sure. But we do have a pretty good idea of the history of some of these criminal organizations. One of them being the Pike Syndicate, which actually has history going all the way back to the Clone Wars. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the Pike Syndicate, what they did, who they were, and really what they traded in, I'll leave a link up here to my video on them. Add at which let me know down in the comments whether you think I'm right about the state of the criminal enterprises following the collapse of the Empire. Do you think they were really way more equipped to survive than I'm giving them credit, or do you think I'm right that they're probably on the back foot and on their way out? And if you have anything you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, leave it down below in the comments. And last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.